A whopping 30 countries participated in World War One, and the performances of those countries varied from impressively competent to downright awful. And so today I'm going to rank the performance of the major nations in the Great War in a tier list. I'm going to go through each participant's major contributions and decide once and for all who were the top performers and who fell short of expectations. Now do be aware that I'm going to be omitting nations that had minimal impact. So, while the Kingdom of Siam did send 1,300 men, and I'm sure they did fight heroically, unfortunately this time they're not going to make it onto the tier list. So, without further ado, S is the best, D is the worst. Let's get started. Before that, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Incogni. If you Google your name, you might be surprised by how much of your personal information is available online. Your email, phone number, or even your home address can be exposed, making you an easy target for spam calls or scammers. Today's sponsor, Incogni, can help you regain your privacy. Incogni acts like a delete button for all that personal information on the web. It tracks down and removes your information from a wide range of sources, including online directories, commercial databases, and people's search sites. The entire process is fully automated. Even if your data reappears online, Incogni continuously monitors and removes it again as many times as necessary until it's gone for good. If you find a specific site that's exposing your information, you can use the custom removals feature. All you have to do is submit the specific links, and a dedicated privacy expert will take care of the rest. If you want to take back your personal data with Incogni, use the code HSH or the link below to get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/HSH. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this video. So I want to start with Belgium. Now, Belgium is often viewed as essentially just the corridor through which Germany invaded France. But really, that completely overlooks how important their contribution to the war was. Now, to understand why Belgium was so important, we need to have a look at the difficult geographical position that Germany was in 1914. It was facing the prospect of a two-front war against France and Russia, which would be very difficult for them to win. To avoid that, they devised the famous Schlieffen Plan. The idea was that they would invade France incredibly fast and knock it out of the war quickly before Russia had time to mobilize. As you can see, the key to the whole plan was speed. However, for the Germans to be able to defeat France so quickly, it needed to bypass the heavily fortified border, and so the Germans wanted to go through Belgium. That was because Belgium had open terrain, and the Germans would be able to make use of their railway network. In the end, the Germans sent the Belgians an ultimatum. Essentially, they had to grant the Germans free passage into France, and if they did, Germany would leave as soon as possible and pay for any damages. If Belgium refused, then Germany would declare war. Now, despite being menaced like that by a much larger, more powerful country, Belgium said no. That's despite the fact that they were really not in that much of a position to do so. Belgium had a tiny population compared to Germany, and as a state it wasn't at all militaristic. In fact, it was actually baked into the treaty that recognized Belgium's independence. Article 7 required Belgium to always remain neutral in a war, acting as something like a buffer between the great powers. Anyway, long story short, since they had no business getting involved in a war, even for its size, its military was weak. Their field army was very small, only around 120,000 men, of which only a bit more than 10% were actually professional soldiers. They had a relatively small military budget and almost no motorized vehicles. Instead, they had to rely on horses and even dogs for transport. Now, given all that, the Germans weren't expecting much resistance. They thought that Belgium would basically just roll over pretty quickly. Their first objective was to take the city of Liège, which was defended by 12 forts. Liège was important because it controlled the main railways into France. That was crucial for Germany's plan for a lightning-fast invasion. The Germans estimated that taking the city would take 2 days at most, but that turned out to be a huge underestimate. The Belgians actually put up stiff resistance, and in their initial raid, the Germans were unable to capture any of the forts. The forts were quite decent. They were made from reinforced concrete and sunk deep underground, which made them difficult to take. With the battle dragging on for days, the Germans resorted to massive howitzers, which the fortresses weren't designed to withstand. The bombardment made resisting impossible, and eventually the last fort surrendered. The Germans had taken Liège, but it had taken them almost 2 weeks instead of the 2 days that they had estimated. Now, that delay was not the only bad news for the Germans. One of the main reasons that they had wanted to take the city of Liège was because of its railway network, but the Germans didn't end up getting access to that. That was because the Belgians had sabotaged their own railways and bridges as soon as the invasion began. That caused enormous problems for the Germans, and they had to spend precious time repairing the infrastructure just to get around. By early September, a whole month after the invasion had started, only about 300 miles of the 2,500-mile network were functional. That meant that the German troops and horses had to exhaust themselves carrying supplies for kilometers. In the end, the entire process of fighting through Belgium took the Germans nearly 3 weeks. That was absolutely crucial because it gave the French and the British time to prepare. The German invasion of France did initially go well, but then the French and the British were able to stop them at the Battle of the Marne, ending the Germans' hopes for a quick victory. The failure of the German plan was, in part, because the Belgians put up such stiff resistance. When the Germans made it to the outskirts of Paris, they were exhausted and their logistics had collapsed. One of the best examples of Belgium's heroism is that they actually flooded their own country to keep the Germans at bay. What happened was, by October of 1914, Belgium had lost about 90% of its territory, and it looked like it was about to be completely overrun. To prevent that, the king ordered the floodgates of the Yser River to be opened. The resulting flood transformed the battlefield into a huge lake that the Germans weren't able to cross. That allowed Belgium to hold on to a sliver of its territory until the very end of the war. That was actually crucial because it prevented the Allies from being outflanked in the famous race to the sea. So, overall, I think considering their size, the amount of resistance that the Belgians were able to put up was incredible. I think they fought really hard against impossible odds, and so I'm going to put them in the B tier. Okay, so now let's have a look at France. Well, as much as the French military got a terrible reputation for their performance in the Second World War, in the First World War, they really did a lot of the heavy lifting for the Allies. Their first major encounter with the Germans was the Battle of Frontiers, which did actually turn out to be a disaster. The French followed an all-out offensive doctrine which relied on spirit and bayonet charges over defensive firepower. Of course, those tactics were completely outdated by the time the First World War broke out. That disastrous strategy led to the French taking 300,000 casualties in just the opening month. The point at which they were able to turn things around was the Battle of the Marne that I mentioned earlier. That battle was very close to Paris, and so if the French lost it, the Germans would probably have taken Paris. The French resistance was really quite heroic. In one famous story, they used 600 taxicabs to transport 6,000 reinforcements to the front. Now, while the impact on the battle of that was relatively minor, it became a famous symbol of French determination. Throughout the whole war, the French bore the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front. Throughout the middle years of the war, they suffered staggering losses in some major battles. For instance, at Verdun, which was the longest battle of the entire war, it was about 10 months and was a complete meat grinder. Now, the French did manage to hold on to Verdun, but it cost them 400,000 casualties. At the Battle of the Somme as well, the French lost 200,000 men. Even in the last months of the conflict, when the Americans had entered the war, and there were hundreds of thousands of American and British troops in France, the French military was still responsible for more than half of the front line against the Germans. Overall, I would say that the French paid an absolutely enormous price for the Allied victory. I think it was partly due to the fact that they were defending their own country. In total, they mobilized about 8.4 million men, of which 70% became casualties, and 1.3 million men were killed. Now, it does go without saying that the French offered more than just raw manpower. They were also the industrial heart of the Allied cause. By the end of the war, the French industry had produced more aircraft than either Britain or Germany. The French were also the main supplier of tanks and artillery for the arriving American forces. One final important contribution of the French was that they provided the strategic brain behind the final victories. For years, one of the main problems that the Allies had had was that their leadership was fragmented. They were uncoordinated. Each army was essentially doing its own thing. That all changed with the creation of the Supreme Allied Command. The head of that was the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, and under his command, the Allies finally started to operate as a coordinated force. That played a big role in the Allies' eventual victory. During the German attack of 1918, the so-called Spring Offensive, Foch insisted on a surprise counterattack at the Second Battle of the Marne, which proved successful and shattered Germany's hopes for a final breakthrough. Then, when it was the Allies' turn to attack, he coordinated British and American reinforcements to launch the 100 Days Offensive, the final push to end the war. Now, of course, it was a coalition effort, and the other nations were important, but it's certainly the case that French leadership played a huge role in its success. In summary, I would say that the French really bore the primary burden of holding the line against the Germans on the Western Front. Then, when the time came, they coordinated the final offensive into Germany. Overall, I think I'm going to put them in the A tier. Okay, so now let's have a look at Russia. I think the first thing to say about Russia was that it was the largest power in the war in terms of population and landmass, and it was the only major power that didn't make it to the end of the war. On paper, when the war started, they were probably the most formidable of all of the participants. However, pretty quickly they showed that those big numbers didn't count for that much. Now, their first involvement in the war was actually invading Eastern Prussia in 1914, and their hope was that they would be able to capture Berlin, the German capital, while the Germans were busy invading France in the west. However, despite outnumbering the Germans about 3-1, the offensive was an absolute catastrophe. The smaller German forces were able to completely annihilate them, and they were forced to retreat back across the border. In total, that campaign cost the Russians about 240,000 men, compared with the Germans, who only lost about 40,000. In fact, the defeat was so humiliating that one Russian commander actually took his own life, rather than have to live with the shame. Now, it must be said that although that offensive was a complete disaster for Russia, it did achieve something for the Allies, which was to relieve pressure on France. In fact, the Germans were forced to pull about 80,000 men away from the Western Front during the most crucial days of the Marne campaign, and that was actually important in stopping Germany from taking Paris. Now, that function of Russia, essentially to force the Germans to take resources away from the West, was actually repeated several times throughout the war. Another good example is during the Brusilov offensive of 1916, what many consider to be the most successful Allied operation of the entire war. Russia launched a huge assault against Austria-Hungary that actually brought them very close to collapse. Now, to prevent Austria-Hungary's collapse, the Germans were forced to move a huge number of troops away from the Western Front. That did manage to stop the Austro-Hungarians from collapsing, but it meant that the Germans had to suspend their offensive at Verdun. I think overall, putting pressure on Austria-Hungary like that was probably the biggest contribution that Russia made to the war effort. During the Brusilov offensive that I just mentioned, the Austro-Hungarians actually suffered almost 700,000 casualties. While they did continue fighting from that point on, they were basically completely subordinate to Germany. Now, while the Brusilov offensive did cause a huge crisis for Germany and Austria-Hungary, it was also incredibly taxing on Russia itself, and really, it pushed the Russians to the brink. The campaign cost the Russians over 1 million casualties and put enormous pressure on their struggling economy, which led to widespread discontent. By that point, the population was hungry and furious at the government, which they saw as both incompetent and out of touch. In 1917, that anger boiled over into the Russian Revolution, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate. Now, Russia did actually continue fighting in the war for another few months. In fact, they actually launched one final disastrous offensive, but in truth, the country was in chaos, and it really wasn't fit to continue fighting. Over the course of 1917, the communists took power. A few months later, the communist Bolsheviks took Russia out of the war completely. That allowed the Germans to transfer over 40 divisions to the Western Front, which allowed them to launch the Spring Offensive in 1918. I will talk more about this later, but the Spring Offensive was actually pretty successful initially, and the Germans were able to break the stalemate of trench warfare and advance 60 kilometers. So essentially, Russia's collapse had caused one of the most desperate crises for the Allies. Now, overall, I would say Russia really didn't live up to the expectations that it had or its potential. While they were important in the war, I really think that with better leadership and better equipment, they could have performed a lot better. So overall, I think I'm going to put them in the C tier. Okay, now I'm going to talk about one of the less often talked about participants in the war, and that is Romania. I think it's fair to say that Romania's participation in the war was an absolute disaster. Now, when the war started, Romania was actually allied with the Central Powers, but they didn't join them in the fight. That was because they were actually interested in taking some territories from Austria-Hungary, in particular Transylvania, which had a large ethnic Romanian population. 1916 seemed to be the perfect time for them to make their move and join the war against the Central Powers. Russia had just launched the Brusilov offensive, and Austria-Hungary appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Romania took the opportunity to join the Allies. Romania mobilized a huge force and launched a surprise attack, advancing 50 miles into Austria-Hungary. However, after that initial success, things started to go extremely badly for them. The Central Powers responded with a huge counteroffensive, and by the end of the year, Romania had lost half its army and about 3/4 of its territory was occupied. To add insult to injury, Romania actually ended up becoming an asset to the Central Powers. They became a lifeline. You see, by 1916, the Central Powers were facing severe shortages due to the British naval blockade, and they really needed a way to sustain their war effort. The Romanian territories were immensely rich in grain and oil, so the Central Powers realized that if they could occupy Romania, that would go a long way towards solving their problems. In the end, occupying Romania did turn out to be a huge help for the Central Powers. Millions of tons of resources were exported, and that really helped the Central Powers stay in the fight. I do think it's worth quickly addressing the question of why was Romania's intervention so disastrous? I mean, they were right to realize that Austria-Hungary was incredibly weak at that time, and striking when they were at their weakest was actually a good plan. Well, I think a big part of the problem was that they actually left everything too late. When they finally joined in with the Brusilov offensive, it was already starting to slow down, and the Central Powers were already recovering. In fact, the reason that the Romanians left it so late was because they were trying to negotiate with the Russians about what territory they would get from Austria-Hungary. When they finally did join the offensive, the Prime Minister of Romania was aware that the moment had passed, and that it might well be a disaster, but he couldn't back down by that point. Anyway, even with a large part of their country occupied, the Romanians kept on fighting, and actually, when they had some competent leadership from the French, they had some impressive victories in 1917. Unfortunately, all that was too little too late. Of course, what eventually happened was Russia collapsed, and so Romania was left isolated, and clearly it was in no position to stand up to the Central Powers on its own. It was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty that essentially turned it into a kind of vassal state that the Central Powers ruthlessly plundered for supplies for their war economy. Overall, I would say it was a pretty poor and chaotic performance from the Romanians. They initially switched sides, then they bungled their entry into the war, and then, when they were involved, they performed terribly badly. However, there is actually one great irony to all this, which is that in the end, they got exactly what they wanted. In late 1918, when the Austro-Hungarians had already collapsed and Germany was in the process of collapsing, the Romanians saw another opportunity and they rushed troops into the already collapsed Austria-Hungary, which allowed them to get control of Transylvania. Transylvania remains a part of Romania to this day. Overall, coming to the rankings, I think I'm going to put Romania in the D tier. Okay, now let's talk about Austria-Hungary. They, of course, started the war because they wanted to invade Serbia. And they thought, given that they were much larger, with a much larger population, they would be able to knock Serbia out of the war very quickly. In the end, they really couldn't have been more wrong. the Austro-Hungarians launched 3 separate attempts to invade Serbia, and they were repelled every time. Even when the Austro-Hungarians did manage to capture the Serbian capital, they weren't able to hold on to it for very long. In only a few days, the Serbians launched a counteroffensive, and the Austrians had to retreat in chaos. In fact, the withdrawal was so chaotic that one observer described it as a flight rather than a retreat. While things were going badly for them against Serbia, they were also going badly in the east against Russia. Russian forces mobilized faster than was expected, and they launched an invasion of Galicia. The Austro-Hungarians were just about able to hold off the Russians, but they suffered huge losses, and it was only when the Germans intervened that they were able to stabilize the line. By the end of 1914, Austria-Hungary hadn't achieved any of its goals, and it had suffered a whopping 1.2 million casualties. That said, the next year was better. In 1915, Austria-Hungary launched an offensive with the Germans, and they were able to break through the Russian lines, forcing them to retreat far into their territory. Also, again with German help, they did finally manage to occupy Serbia. That said, it wasn't all good news. Italy entered the war against them, and since Germany was busy fighting on the Western Front, Italy was going to have to be Austria-Hungary's responsibility. Now, they did successfully manage to hold off the Italians, but took huge casualties in doing so. The next year, 1916, would be the beginning of the end for the Austro-Hungarians. The Russians launched the Bristol offensive that I've mentioned a couple of times in the video so far, and that really caught Austria-Hungary off guard. Many of their best units were busy fighting in Italy, and the commanders on the front really weren't prepared for the offensive. In just a few weeks, the Russians made huge progress. An entire Austro-Hungarian division surrendered. Austria-Hungary had lost half its army on the front, over 600,000 men. From that point on, they really weren't able to function independently of Germany. That said, the next year, 1917, they did manage to have a breakthrough against Italy at the Battle of Caporetto, and they were able to advance 150 kilometers into Italy. However, they weren't able to capitalize on the victory, and Italy did recover. By 1918, the situation inside Austria-Hungary was dire. There was starvation in the population, plummeting morale, and there were growing calls for independence from various different ethnic groups. They did actually try one final offensive against Italy, but it failed spectacularly. Now, the thing that really caused the Austro-Hungarians to collapse was when the Italians launched an offensive at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. A lot of the Austro-Hungarian troops effectively just gave up. Over a few days, over 400,000 soldiers surrendered and were captured. Now, coming to the rankings, I actually think it's a bit debatable where to place Austria-Hungary. Now, clearly, when they were operating on their own, they really didn't perform as one would expect of such a large empire. They failed to beat Serbia and constantly needed to be saved from the Russians. That said, they did play a big part in the Central Powers being able to fight for so long. Although they did have some big failures, they did just about hold 3 fronts for years, which I think we can agree wasn't really an easy task. While I think everyone would have expected more of them when the war broke out, I do think they deserve some credit for that. So I'm going to put them in the C tier. Okay, now let's talk about Italy. As I'm sure you know, Italy didn't actually join the war in 1914. Eventually, it did join the war in 1915 on the side of Britain, France, and Russia. That was because they were hoping to get some territories that were controlled by Austria-Hungary. And given how badly Austria-Hungary had performed in the first year of the war, the Italians were hoping that they would be able to achieve a quick victory. However, in the end, it didn't turn out to be anything like that. Instead, the Italians found themselves trapped in a grueling nightmare. The Italian front was fought over some of the most hostile terrain in all of Europe, with steep cliffs and freezing mountains, which made the fighting and logistics extremely difficult. As I said, the Italians entered the war in 1915, and for the next 2 years, they essentially fought 11 almost identical battles with the Austro-Hungarians along the Isonzo River. The Italian Chief of Staff, Luigi Cadorna, launched wave after wave of almost suicidal frontal assaults against fortified Austro-Hungarian positions. Even when they kept on failing, he didn't change his strategy. Instead, he blamed his soldiers for cowardice and executed a large number of them. The result of all that was very little territory gained, and at a cost of about 640,000 Italian casualties. When the stalemate did finally break, it was actually broken by the Central Powers at the Battle of Caporetto of 1917. German and Austro-Hungarian forces used infiltration tactics and were able to break the Italian lines, forcing them to retreat over 150 kilometers in total chaos. The Italians lost a huge amount of artillery and supplies, and about 280,000 soldiers were captured. It was actually such a disaster that, to this day, the word Caporetto is still used to refer to a complete disaster. However, one good thing did come out of Caporetto, and that was that it forced a change of leadership. The old Italian Chief of Staff, Cadorna, was fired, and the new Chief of Staff, Armando Diaz, stopped the suicidal attacks and began to reform the army. Those reforms did prove effective, and in 1918 the Italian army was able to repel a huge Austro-Hungarian offensive, and then it went on to launch its own offensive. At the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, the Italian forces won a huge victory, capturing about 400,000 men and shattering the Austro-Hungarian army. That pretty much led to the collapse of Austria-Hungary and the end of the Italian front, with Italy as the winner. So, how to rank Italy? Well, there were two major contributions to the war that Italy made. One was that they opened up a new front, which spread the Austro-Hungarian forces thin. The second thing is that they dealt the final blow to the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. However, I think that does kind of make their achievements sound more impressive than they really were. In fact, some historians don't even really see the Battle of Vittorio Veneto as a real battle, due to the terrible state that the Austro-Hungarian army was in by that point. They were already in a state of collapse, with many units abandoning the front. Also, while it is true that they captured nearly 500,000 men in that battle, something that needs to be taken into account is that most of those men were actually captured due to a communication blunder by the Austro-Hungarians. They failed to communicate the correct date of the armistice and ordered their men to stop fighting 24 hours before the armistice actually took effect. The Italians took advantage of that and captured as many Austro-Hungarian soldiers as they could in order to have more leverage at the peace talks. Overall, I really don't think that Italy was very impressive in the war. In particular, I think they were hindered by terrible leadership from their Chief of Staff, Cadorna. Their only major victory was against an army that was already effectively collapsing. Up until that point, they'd taken about 2 million casualties and barely achieved anything. Overall, I think I'm going to put them in the D tier. Okay, now for another of the less talked about participants in the war, and that is Bulgaria. So, like Italy, Bulgaria didn't actually join the war in 1914, but in 1915, but they joined on the side of the Central Powers. They actually joined an ongoing invasion of Serbia, and together with the Austro-Hungarians, they were able to completely overwhelm the Serbs. With Bulgaria in the war, Serbia fell in just 6 weeks, and the entire country was occupied in the following months. That was actually very important because it gave the Central Powers land continuity. It created a corridor for transferring weapons and resources between the different countries. That crucially allowed the Ottoman Empire to receive more help, and that was very important in sustaining their war effort. In fact, it was actually because the Ottomans were able to receive heavy artillery by train that the Allies realized that the Gallipoli campaign was a lost cause, and so they abandoned it. Now, Bulgaria also played an important role in the war in 1916. If you remember, that was the year that Romania joined the war on the side of the Allies, and they attacked Austria-Hungary. Bulgaria played an important role in the Austro-Hungarian counteroffensive, pincering the Romanian forces. As I mentioned earlier, occupying Romania was hugely valuable for the Central Powers, as it gave them grain and oil, which they desperately needed to survive the Allied blockade. Bulgaria was also very important in fighting in the south. In fact, for 3 years, Bulgaria was the primary force responsible for holding the Macedonian front. They actually faced a big multinational coalition that included forces from Britain, France, Greece, Serbia, Italy, and even Russia. The Allies tried many times to break through there, but the Bulgarian forces were able to hold them off. In fact, by late 1917, the Allies had nearly 600,000 men there, and they were effectively stuck, unable to be sent to more promising theatres of the war. Now, that said, Bulgaria's success didn't last forever, and when their collapse came, it was actually pretty abrupt. In September of 1918, the Allies launched a massive offensive on the Macedonian front, in which they hoped to knock Bulgaria out of the war, and they were successful. After a heavy bombardment, the Allies exploited a gap in the Bulgarian line, which forced them to retreat in disarray, and many men deserted. The army collapsed in just 4 days, and Bulgaria signed an armistice. Now, I think it's worth quickly addressing the question of why did they collapse so suddenly, given that they had been fighting so well before that? The main reason was because by that point, Germany couldn't help them nearly as much as they had been previously. The Germans moved troops and equipment away from the Macedonian front, despite the desperate requests of the Bulgarians. When the Bulgarians saw that help disappear, just as the Allied forces were growing, that made them feel like their front was being deserted. That, combined with a severe shortage of food and clothing, makes it pretty easy to see why the Bulgarian soldiers rebelled and the army collapsed. However, I do think we can see just how important Bulgaria was to the Central Powers from what happened after they collapsed. Their surrender effectively triggered a domino effect, which brought down the other Central Powers countries. Effectively, Bulgaria was something like the glue that was holding the whole thing together. In fact, one historian, Richard C. Hall, has actually argued that if Bulgaria hadn't held the Macedonian front for as long as they did, the Central Powers might well have collapsed as early as 1916. Anyway, coming to the rankings, I think Bulgaria did very well. I think they punched well above their weight, and so I'm going to put them in the A tier. Okay, so now let's talk about Serbia. I would say that, given its size, Serbia was actually one of the best performers in the whole war. Now, when the fighting began, everyone expected them to perform pretty badly and be pretty quickly erased from the map. But in the end, they actually humiliated Austria-Hungary in the first few months of the war. The Serbian army was able to repel the initial Austro-Hungarian invasion and was actually able to rout them, forcing them into a chaotic retreat across the border. The Austro-Hungarians did then try 2 more invasion attempts, but both of them were costly failures. All in all, by the end of 1914, Serbia had been able to defend its territory from Austria-Hungary, and in the process, it had actually inflicted twice as many casualties as they had suffered. That said, the next year, 1915, didn't go so well for them. For a start, they had a terrible typhus epidemic that killed more people than Austria-Hungary had managed to the previous year. Even worse was that the Central Powers launched another invasion attempt, but this time it was led by the Germans. The exhausted Serbian army did try to resist, but then when Bulgaria joined the war and they joined the invasion, the Serbians found themselves outflanked and they were defeated. In the end, the entire country was overrun. That said, the Serbs didn't give up there. The Serbian Supreme Command ordered people to retreat across the freezing mountains of Montenegro and Albania, with the hope that Britain, France, and Russia would help to keep them alive and they would be able to return as a more formidable force. The retreat across the mountains was incredibly costly. The Serbs lost more than half of the 400,000 people who attempted it. People succumbed to starvation, illness, or they just froze to death on the mountains. That said, as costly as it was, it did eventually pay off. The Allies were able to evacuate those Serbian survivors to a Greek island, and there they were able to retrain and re-equip. Those men were eventually deployed to the Macedonian front in 1916, and there they would face the Bulgarians once again. Now, fast forwarding to late 1918, the Serbians finally had their chance to get revenge on the Bulgarians. It was at the Battle of Dobro Pole that the Serbian army, with the help of the French, was able to break the Bulgarian line and drove them into chaos. The Bulgarians weren't able to regroup and they fled, and the country signed an armistice soon after that. The Serbians were then able to return to their homeland, and by November, all of Serbia was liberated. Overall, I would say that given their size, Serbia really had quite a big impact on how the war played out. In particular, the fact that in the first year of the war, they were able to tie down about 400,000 Austro-Hungarian troops meant that Austria-Hungary wasn't able to focus entirely on Russia. Something else that I think is impressive is the fact that they didn't surrender even when their entire country was overrun. That allowed their army to eventually return from the dead and achieve that crucial breakthrough on the Macedonian front. As I mentioned earlier, that really was the first domino in the collapse of the Central Powers. Overall, I think I'm going to put Serbia in the A tier. Okay, now let's do the Ottoman Empire. So, the Ottoman Empire entered the war in an incredibly weak position. In fact, it was by that point so weak that the question of what to do with the crumbling empire was actually referred to simply as the Eastern Question. So, as you can imagine, when World War I started in 1914, everyone assumed that it would collapse incredibly quickly. In the end, though, they put up far more resistance than anyone expected. Something to point out is that they didn't actually join the war when it started. They joined in October of 1914. The start of the war didn't go well for them. They were fighting against Russia in the Caucasus, and they attempted a very ambitious encirclement maneuver of the Russian forces at Syrikamish. However, the Russians were able to react quickly and crush the Ottoman forces. The Ottomans took huge casualties, in part because of the harsh weather. They lost about 70% of their men, with tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers freezing to death. As all that was going on, in the south, in Egypt, the Ottomans tried to seize the Suez Canal from the British, but that also ended up a disaster, due in part to logistical problems, the British defences, and again to very harsh weather. Now, with the Ottomans seemingly performing extremely badly, the Allies decided that they might be on the verge of collapse, so they came up with a plan that they hoped would knock the Ottomans out of the war quickly, the famous, or maybe infamous, Gallipoli campaign. That turned out to be one of the biggest disasters for the Allies in the entire war. For 8 months, the Ottomans fiercely defended Constantinople. The Allies committed 500,000 men, but weren't able to break the Ottoman lines. Eventually, after 250,000 casualties and no victory in sight, the Allies abandoned the invasion. Now, I should point out that the Ottomans suffered as many casualties as the invaders, but they had been able to defend their capital. Over the next few years, the Ottomans continued fighting, and their impact on the war was significant. First, they were able to strangle Russia's economy. The Ottomans closed the Dardanelles Straits, which meant that imports to Russia were much more difficult. The Dardanelles was virtually the only year-round sea route to Russia, and so by closing it, the Ottomans isolated Russia economically. That, of course, led to shortages and instability, and eventually that crisis sparked the Russian Revolution. Another important contribution of the Ottomans was that they tied down a huge number of Allied resources. Britain, in particular, was forced to divert a huge number of troops and supplies, which relieved pressure on the Central Powers in Europe. In fact, the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, later estimated that the Ottomans getting involved in the war had actually lengthened the war by about 2 years. Now, while that might be an exaggeration, I think it still shows that they really did have quite a big impact. All that said, after years of war, the Allies were able to grind the Ottomans down. Eventually, the British were able to push deep into Ottoman territory, and the Ottomans couldn't hold them off. By 1918, after years of casualties, desertions, and shortages, the army was on its last legs. The final blow to the Ottoman Empire came when Bulgaria left the war, which severed its connection to Germany. That left it isolated and exhausted, and the Ottomans were forced to sign an armistice. In the years that followed, the Ottoman Empire was completely dismantled. So, coming to the rankings, where should we put the Ottoman Empire? I think it's important to say that their offensives were almost all failures, but at the same time, they did have quite a big impact on the war. they accelerated the Russian collapse and tied down a lot of Allied resources. Overall, I think that while they weren't a top performer, they did better than many expected, so I'm going to put them in the C tier. So now let's have a look at the British Empire, and here I do mean the whole empire. So I'm talking about the combined forces of the UK, Canada, Australia, India, and all the other parts of the empire. First, I think it would be good to have a look at how the British Empire performed on the Western Front. Well, initially, when the war started, the British had just a tiny professional force, what was called the British Expeditionary Force. While those soldiers were very high quality, their numbers simply weren't enough for the scale of the conflict that awaited. In the early battles in Belgium, the British Expeditionary Force was almost wiped out trying to hold back the Germans. Now, they did contribute somewhat to slow the German advance, but they suffered huge casualties, which resulted in quite a crisis for them. Clearly, the British were going to need more men if they were going to have a significant impact on the war. The British government responded by transforming its small professional force into a huge citizen army. That expansion was initially just volunteers, but was later sustained by conscription. However, given that those new recruits were inexperienced, it meant that the middle years of the war became a period of very bloody lessons for the British. One very famous example of that is the Battle of the Somme of 1916. On the first day alone, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, and by the end of the battle, they'd suffered 400,000. Now, while that did relieve pressure on the French, who were fighting at the Battle of Verdun, and it did inflict a lot of casualties on the Germans, it was still a huge blow for the British Army. That said, the British did learn and adapt. Over the next 2 years, they worked on integrating infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft into a cohesive fighting force. Those new tactics were eventually put to the test in 1918 when the Germans launched the Spring Offensive. In that, the British just about held on, although it did cost them 400,000 casualties. They were able to halt the German advance. Then, when the moment came to counterattack, the British played a very important role in the 100 Days Offensive. They were able to capture more prisoners and guns than any other Allied army. Together with the Americans and the French, they shattered the German lines and eventually forced them to surrender. Overall, throughout the war on the Western Front, the British Army evolved from a tiny fighting force at the beginning to one of the biggest and most powerful armies. Now, if we turn our attention to the war outside of Europe, the British were incredibly important. In the Middle East, they defeated the Ottoman Empire, and in Africa, they were able to dismantle much of the German colonial empire. They also got involved in Italy and Macedonia, where they helped stabilize those fronts. All that said, I think, by far, Britain's biggest contribution to the war was, of course, from its dominance of the seas. The British Royal Navy played a huge role in the Allied victory, allowing them to transport troops and all sorts of supplies from all across the world. Incredibly important was, of course, the naval blockade of Germany. By cutting off Germany's access to imports, the British gradually starved the Central Powers into submission. The effect of that did start slowly, but it intensified as the war went on. The true impact of the blockade was really felt in the final years of the war. By 1918, German imports were at a fifth of their pre-war levels. The food shortages affected not just the soldiers, but the entire population. Of course, that internal agony created huge discontent in Germany, and that fueled riots and accelerated the end of the war. As I've talked about in the video, that sort of crisis happened in all the other Central Powers countries. So, coming to the rankings, I think, despite some blunders, the British Empire's contribution was, of course, incredibly important. Their army became a powerful force that helped deliver the final blow on the Western Front, and their navy was crucial in slowly strangling the enemy's economy. I think I'm going to put them in the A tier. Okay, now let's talk about the United States. When the war began, the American public wanted nothing to do with it. From their point of view, the Europeans were always fighting over something or other. There was no reason why they should get involved. However, after a series of events, public opinion changed and America did join the war in April of 1917. Now, it's important to say that when America first got involved in the conflict, their army was pretty small. It was only about 128,000 men, so they had to expand it as fast as possible and at the same time transport what forces they did have to France. Because the American force was pretty small, the Germans initially didn't take the American threat very seriously. They estimated that the US wouldn't be able to have a large army in Europe until 1919. Initially, it did actually seem like the Americans weren't going to change the course of the war much. By early 1918, they had only about 150,000 troops in France. Also, something that I should point out is that up until that point, the Americans weren't really involved in combat that much. That was because the American commander, John J. Pershing, was very determined that the American forces remain independent of the British and French command. That was because he knew that his men were very inexperienced, so there would have been the temptation for the British and French to essentially use them as cannon fodder and preserve their more experienced soldiers. What all that means is that even when there was a reasonable number of American troops in France, they spent a few months training and getting experience in trench warfare in some of the quieter parts of the line. However, things changed dramatically in the spring of 1918. In March, Russia formally pulled out of the war, which allowed a huge number of German troops to be transferred to the Western Front and launched the Spring Offensive, Germany's last desperate attempt to win the war. That was initially successful in breaking the Allied lines, and that forced the Americans to get more seriously involved in the fighting. They began to ship troops to Europe as fast as they could. Eventually, the situation in France was so dire that Pershing, the American commander, was willing to put his entire force under the command of the Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch. The Allies were able to get a huge number of American troops to France, and by May of 1918, there were about 600,000 American soldiers in Europe. By July, that number had doubled to 1.2 million. The endless stream of fresh manpower broke the German spirits, and by the summer of 1918, the German High Command was convinced that victory wasn't going to be possible. In August, the Allies launched the 100 Days Offensive, which pushed the exhausted Germans back. Eventually, with no options left, the Germans were forced to request an armistice in November. At the time that the war ended, there were about 2 million American soldiers in Europe. So, coming to the rankings, where should we place America? Well, as you can see, America was vital to ending the war, but I do think that it needs to be said that their impact was limited to the very end. It was really only in the last 8 months of the war that America was truly involved. That is only about 15% of the duration of the whole conflict, and so I do think they need to be marked down a bit for that. That said, their economic and naval contribution was a game changer. They gave massive loans to the Allies, and their navy and merchant ships were crucial to help the Allies survive their financial and resource crises. I think without American help, it's likely that Britain and France would have had to compromise a lot more in the negotiations to end the war. Overall, I'm going to put the Americans in the B tier. Okay, so last but certainly not least, let's have a look at Germany. In 1914, when the war started, the Central Powers really shouldn't have had much of a chance. They were fighting the combined forces of Britain, France, and Russia. Those countries possessed twice the population and triple the industrial output of the Central Powers. Also, Britain, France, and Russia were in a good position geographically surrounding the Central Powers. Overall, I would say it looked like it should have been a fairly straightforward job for the Allies to win. And yet, despite that, the Central Powers didn't just survive for 4 years, but at times they really looked like they might win. I think that Germany should get the majority of the credit for that. On the Western Front, they faced France, Britain, and Belgium, and eventually the United States. Meanwhile, in the East, they fought very well against Russia and were constantly having to bail out Austria-Hungary. Even in a war that was famous for its stalemates, Germany came remarkably close to breaking through on 2 occasions. In 1914, their initial push into France brought them within 30 miles of Paris. Perhaps even more impressive was when they did it again in 1918 during the Spring Offensive. After 3.5 years of trench warfare, the Germans were the ones who finally broke the deadlock and actually made it within shelling distance of Paris. The city actually came under severe long-range bombardment. Now, while the Allies did manage to defend Paris both times, I think one still has to give credit to the Germans for getting so close. Also, I really think it's important to remember that Germany did win the war in the East. I think because they eventually lost the war in the end, it's easy to forget that they actually won it against Russia. They did manage to get Russia to collapse. When they were fighting the Russians, they had some amazing performances. I think the best one might be the Battle of Tannenberg right at the beginning of the war, where the Germans annihilated the Russians, inflicting about 10 casualties for every man that they lost. Another good example is the Galicia-Tarnów offensive, the biggest military victory of 1915. There, the Central Powers forced the Russians into a chaotic retreat, which cost them 1.4 million casualties. I would say that one of the biggest reasons that the Germans fought so well was because their army evolved a lot throughout the course of the war. Perhaps the most famous example of the German innovations was the development of infiltration tactics carried out by elite soldiers known as stormtroopers. The stormtroopers were highly mobile units equipped with a variety of weapons, from knives to light machine guns or even flamethrowers. Unlike traditional infantry, they were trained to sneak into the enemy lines and cause chaos. Now, infiltration tactics were incredibly effective. For instance, at the Battle of Caporetto against the Italians, they were a big part of how they achieved that victory. Also at the Battle of Cambrai, where the British used tanks to try to break the German lines. The Germans then used infiltration tactics to counterattack and push the British back beyond the initial starting position. Infiltration tactics were also a big part of the Spring Offensive of 1918. I think something else that's very impressive about the German performance is that they were able to achieve so much even though their allies underperformed. Fighting alongside Austria-Hungary has actually been described as being quote-unquote shackled to a corpse. The Ottomans too heavily depended on German financing, equipment and officers to stay in the fight. Even Bulgaria, which was Germany's more competent ally, required some assistance. I think the Germans also put in a great performance on the home front. The British naval blockade was slowly strangling the nation, which meant that resources were very scarce and food shortages fueled unrest. However, despite those problems, Germany managed to sustain their war effort for 4 years. Now, of course, Germany wasn't perfect. They did make some mistakes. For instance, I think some of the economic problems caused by the naval blockade were actually worsened by some of their policies. For example, the conscription of farm labour and the requisitioning of horses crippled German agriculture. In military terms, some of their decisions did burn through a huge amount of manpower. For instance, grinding battles like those at Verdun or the Somme inflicted nearly equal numbers of casualties on either side, and that wasn't a trade that the Germans were able to make when their enemy had far more men and resources. I think perhaps Germany's biggest error in the war was their decision to leave over 1 million troops in Eastern Europe after Russia collapsed. Those men were desperately needed on the Western Front, but instead of transferring them, the Germans essentially overplayed their hand and they tried to occupy all that territory in Eastern Europe. Really, those men would have been better used fighting in France. Overall, although Germany's performance wasn't flawless, I think they were pretty extraordinary. They were facing a coalition of the world's greatest superpowers on 2 fronts. All the while they had underperforming allies and limited resources, and yet they still came very close to winning. For that reason, I think we have no choice but to put them in the S tier. So that is the completed tier list. If you want to learn more about the causes of the First World War, I have actually made a tier list video about that, so be sure to check that out. Thanks so much for watching.